So this talk is on data-driven peace building, and our speakers today are Dr. Andreas Hirblinger and Dr. Kristina Hook. So each author is going to take about 7 to 10 minutes to speak about the work that they've done with the Ottawa Dialogue for their policy briefs and how it's blended into the work that they're doing now. Both authors wrote more broadly on the topic of data and peace. I'll introduce each individually right before you speak. I'm going to begin with Dr. Andreas Hirblinger. So Dr. Andreas Hirblinger wrote a brief for us quite recently called Multi-Track Digital Inclusion and Data-Driven Peacemaking. And again, I'll link that in the chat right after these opening remarks, and I'll give his introduction now. Dr. Andreas Hirblinger is a senior researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute Center on Conflict, Development, and Peacebuilding. And he conducts research on digital peacebuilding, focusing on how the use of digital technologies by conflict parties, stakeholders, and peacebuilding actors shape understandings of conflict and peacebuilding approaches. His current SNSF Ambizioni, I hope I said that right, project is called An Apo-Mediated Peace, and it explores how various digital and political contexts influence peacebuilding dynamics and outcomes. And he completed his PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. So I'll give the floor to Andreas now. A reminder to our speakers is that following the presentations, there's going to be a Q&A period. So please just refrain from unmuting yourselves until we get to that period, but you're welcome to put your questions in the chat and I'll read them out once we get to that period. So I will pass the floor to Andreas, and I'll just send you a private message, Andreas, if we're running short on time.
Great, Laura, thank you so much. And thanks for making all the efforts to pronounce my Bavarian family name correctly. You did well. Usually people fail. I have basically just 1 or 2 slides here to share. Thank you so much also for the invitation to contribute to the policy brief series. I think it's a very exciting new and fresh series, and really great to have a platform there to also discuss topics related to the digitalization of peacebuilding. So I'll speak briefly about what I've written across those 6 or so pages. And obviously the brief starts with a rather kind of obvious observation now that we've recently seen increasing digitalization of peacemaking efforts. The pandemic played a considerable role here because it did kind of increase the need to use these tools to keep processes alive, but it also led to an acceleration of innovation. Many of the tools that are used now, such as Zoom, are much more user-friendly now and much more safe to use also than they were a couple of years ago. But we've also seen over the past years an increasing interest in just generally in data-driven facilitation and mediation approaches using quite specialized applications. For instance, online mass focus groups that promise to generate statistically reliable results about population preferences, but also social media listening tools, for instance, that hope to generate insights about populations' narratives and stances that could be somehow used in support of peacemaking. And then there's probably also quite a broad array of ways in which kind of data is kind of thrown into peace processes in various ways through scientific reports, the outputs of online surveys, mapping exercises, remote sensing, satellite Earth observations, and so on, and all that stuff somehow gets entered into peace processes. And I think it's good to make sense of how such data can be used and employed in ways that are participatory and inclusive. So this is what the policy briefs tries to do. But I want to maybe briefly just take one step back and talk about how we should really how I think we should generally think about the digitization of peacemaking. And I think one key aspect is to not focus merely on tools. Because if we focus on tools, we very often kind of leave the social, the political, and the human dimensions of digitization out of the picture. I hear quite often at talks like this and also at conferences this slogan that tools or technologies are not neutral. And while that might be right, I think it's the wrong starting point. I think what's important is to not think about tools as such, but to think about the use of tools or technologies, the use of tools, data, etc. That being not neutral. Data sets and algorithms are biased because the humans that create those data sets and algorithms are biased, and because they attribute a bias to data and algorithms. So I think it's quite important, generally speaking, to think about what I would call kind of socio-technical systems or maybe human-machine interactions when we think about how to best use digital technology for peacemaking. So to just go to the core of the brief, and here comes the actual slide, because obviously the first slide was just the front page of the brief. So the brief suggests to think about data-driven peace building, inclusive data-driven peace building, along a conceptual model that would discuss, or that would focus on data sharing between tracks and data sharing across tracks. And obviously, digital tech as such doesn't really have tracks. We have seen, though, we've run a survey last summer with participants from the mediation support community, and there is kind of a tracked logic to digitization. There is an uptake of tools, particularly on track 2 and 3, and less so on track 1. So high-level negotiations very often are still kind of done in an old-fashioned, quote-unquote, analog in-person manner. And that begs the question of how one can, in fact, leverage data-driven approaches to make track 1 negotiations more inclusive. So thinking about this along kind of the multi-track model, the first bit would be to say we need to think about data sharing between tracks. And here the obvious observation is that a lot of data gets collected that kind of represents the needs and interests of certain stakeholders, and that data is usually collected across at one particular track, and usually it's track 2 or 3, as I've just said. So that would usually be through, for instance, online consultations, WhatsApp focus groups, online workshops, etc. And now, I think what's worthwhile thinking a little bit more about is how this data would then actually get used at higher levels. And very often, particularly the results of specialized applications are used maybe by mediation teams to inform their process design, etc. But very little is known, in fact, and I think very little is done to actually offer that data directly to participants at higher tracks. What's I think also important here, just one last point, when we think about basically data transfer between tracks, is that the very act of transferring data obviously is quite political. So data gets analyzed, it gets condensed, it gets represented in a particular way. Certain details get lost while other details get emphasized. And so there is kind of a lot of politics involved here. And I think it would be worthwhile both for research and for practice to reflect more on that. And then the second part of this kind of conceptual way of thinking about inclusive data use in mediation is to think about data deliberation within tracks. And we know quite little about, in fact, how data that tells, for instance, about the needs and interests of stakeholders or just, kind of scientific data, how it actually is absorbed in a negotiation context. But I do think there is a lot to argue for the fact that if this data should be or can be accepted legitimate, then this is because there has been some sort of process of discussion, of deliberation, through which the parties involved can question how the data was generated, through what methods, from what sources, and also to discuss the relevance, in fact, of that data for decision making. So, for instance, if you have data on ceasefire violations, or if you have data that would tell whether a population prefers a unitary or federal governance system, parties who are involved in a negotiation and will make technical decisions what should go into a peace agreement will want to have both a look at the sources, the methods to which this data was generated, and then also jointly discuss the implications of that. To conclude, one last aspect in all of this is to think about data. Obviously, it can be an end in itself. It can be thought of as entailing critical information and evidence that would help make peace processes and their outcomes better, quote unquote. But it's also good to think about it as a means to an end, namely as a tool, as an object, basically around which negotiations can take place and around which conflict transformation can take place, because it is, basically it provides an opportunity to basically exercise and train parties in engaging with each other in a kind of a positive and conflict transformative manner. I'll stop here, Laura. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And again, I did link the full brief in the chat if you'd like to read a little bit more. I thought that was a really great presentation, and a lot of novel issues are being put forward. And I think that Kristina could maybe build upon that as well. I'm going to introduce you now. So Dr. Kristina Hook is going to speak on her brief, The Information Revolution and Opportunities for Multi-Track Diplomacy in a High Violence Situation, the Increasing Importance of Data Organization and Local Input for Policy Shaping. Dr. Hook is an assistant professor of conflict management at Kennesaw State University's School of Conflict Management, Peacebuilding and Development in North Atlanta in Georgia, USA. She's an anthropologist and a scholar practitioner specializing in large-scale violence against civilians, including genocides and mass atrocities, as well as emerging forms of warfare and violence. And again, I'll just share that link shortly, and I'll pass the floor to you, Kristina, and you have screen sharing abilities as well, if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's such a pleasure to be back with my friends and colleagues at the Ottawa Dialogue. And I also had the benefit of going second, so I'm already picking up on a lot of the themes that Andreas has brought out in his work. I'm looking forward to our discussion a little bit later. So it does really segue into this point of the conversation that Andreas's brief set me up for. And it comes out a little bit, I think, in my background. So I'm an anthropologist who works in large-scale violence, by which I mean genocide and mass atrocities. So there's two impulses there that kind of routinely create tension in my work. The first is that as an anthropologist, it's really important for me to really do what I can in my professional role to bring in culturally specific nuance, to bring in local voices, to emphasize the fact that local voices is not one monolithic voice in a particular context, but is actually something quite complex itself. But then I also work with genocides and mass atrocities, and for all of the incredible expertise that local peace builders have, this type of high violence situation often requires, in some role, international actors. And so how do we bring this all together? So, as I was really thinking about the state of the field, as I was writing this brief, I was grappling with a theme that I've seen come out in my own career with policy-informed scholarship over the last 10 years. And that is that we are, this will surprise no one, but we are fully in the information age now. So we're out of the Industrial Revolution and we're into the information revolution. And by which I mean information itself is a productive force. So what I often found, including in some of my policy work, is, when you're sitting in that chair as a policy person, you didn't always need more details about a specific case. You needed somebody to help you organize the chaos of these high violence situations that with the rate of technology, with a lot of the type of modeling that my brief mentions by name, it was that, that dynamic, that feeling of you have this delicate porcelain cup and you got a fire hose going into it. And so in my brief, I specifically cite that in 2015, IBM estimated that 90% of the world's data had been generated in the last 2 years. So beyond just gathering information, we really needed, from the policy perspective, we really needed those who could help organize that information for decision making. And I argue throughout the brief that leads to new opportunities for partnerships, as well as, of course, ethical challenges, but new opportunities and challenges with scholar practitioners and with local actors. So in my brief, I talk about, data being created with these unprecedented speeds. I go into a few examples, as I said, and, I'm arguing that there's these increased spaces for partnership. I'm also arguing that the potential for local actors and scholar practitioners to influence the decision-making process may be happening a bit earlier now as we work through the practical ramifications of information technology. So instead of, a case where a crisis erupts and decision makers say, we really should talk to subject matter experts, maybe they mean scholar practitioners or local experts, in a variety of different fields in a particular context. But now, with a lot of the type of forecasting and technology-based approaches, there really may be opportunities for these multi-track actors to influence not just the reaction to a crisis, but the analysis of it much sooner, as this type of technology has created sort of increased appetite and increased awareness of things like forecasting, early warning, and things like that. So in the paper, I look at the case of Myanmar and I go through it, looking at how, for example, policymakers' access to increased data points on this context didn't solve their problems. Again, I don't think this will surprise our audience, but it's just a good reminder that an increase in discrete data points of a context does not replicate that process of human analysis. And I would argue with my anthropologist hat on, it never replicates that local expertise, that sensitivity to culturally specific nuance. But, as I've been grappling with this issue, I've seen a parallel trend. I've seen it really in my home field of genocide and mass atrocity prevention, but I think similar themes in our wider peace building work of recognizing that we are in this information age, of recognizing that we need frameworks that don't just elicit more details, as I said, but organize them. So anytime we're seeing meta reviews come out of our field, really solid, robust meta reviews, that is something that potentially has the ability to harness that information organizing principle. So as these types of maybe generational changes are occurring in our fields, there's kind of a synergy going on there between what policy needs and what scholar practitioners are increasingly recognizing as important. And then, of course, like we just to stress again and again and again, local actors, diverse local actors who are leaders and experts in a variety of different fields of civil society, broadly conceived, of academia in that context, of religious organizations or others who are really able to tap into local expertise of various sources are really important. And again, just arguing that because of some of these technology changes, they can influence the process a little bit earlier. So I don't have it up on the screen, but I think Laura's put it in the chat. And I'll just point out that, I tried to organize this conversation that I'm having on page 5. I have a very simple diagram, which I have Laura and the Ottawa Dialogue team to thank for, but really just mapping out, okay, what are the needs and what are the opportunities of policymakers in these contexts, of scholar practitioners, and of local experts broadly conceived. And when we begin to look at what both the needs and the challenges are, there are real potentials for synergy. So the way I conceive it, scholar practitioners, they needed local contextual data. You can sit around and theorize all day, but it can change quite rapidly if you're theorizing totally devoid from local context. We know this. So scholar practitioners really need that local contextual data, but they can offer these information organizing tools. We do often in the field of academia have time to sit and to think and to read others' work and to come up with these ways that we can apply empiricism grounded in local knowledge to come up with these information organizing frameworks. So the scholar practitioners needed local contextual data, but could offer these type of empirically based frameworks for organizing data. Policymaker needed that organization tools. As I said, that all of these new information technologies are being offered to policymakers. I've been in that seat myself with some of them. And, there are often phrases that I cite in this policy brief: control your data or die trying, or drown trying, you just this feeling of drowning in data points. So again, their need is that information organization technology. Policymaker resources are, of course, the violence prevention influence. So I'm specifically talking in this brief about high violence contexts, places of genocide and mass atrocity prevention, where some type of international presence, pressure, action of some type is usually required. And then also the local expert needs human security. They need that sort of influence, usually by people outside their situation, but then they can offer that contextual data. So I want to wrap up because I think I've already starting to overstate my welcome with the time allotted to me. But I want to point out that there are some challenges, and I would be remiss if I don't mention the ones that my policy brief talks about. I'll just go over them really quickly. They're in the brief. But potential problems and things to look out for are effectiveness, access, ethics, and safety. I want to pause here. Local actors stay in their context. And so I really tried to do justice to that tension, to be quite careful about the specific types of local actors that I'm suggesting engage policymakers. We know that that's not a potential for all types of local actors, for all of those nodes in the multi-track system, but the ones who can, the ones who are devoted to activities like advocacy may have real possibility. Then also this needs for trust building, the real structural obstacles that can keep this from just being a nice theory, but harder to implement. I try to go into those as well. And then the different professional languages and information needs. So in the interest of, putting my money, or at least my writing where my mouth is, I go through these list of 3 actors and I try to offer some really practical, concrete advice of the challenges and opportunities they have. Maybe I'll leave those for the discussion just so I save time for that, and I'll conclude now.
Thank you so much, Kristina. Well, I would love definitely to hear about that. I've read the brief, but I would still love to learn more. So please feel free to share that. And yeah, I was just going to say, anybody who would like to share a question, please either put it in the chat and I will read it out, or raise your hand. There is one question from Mariana that I'll read out right now. It's for Andreas. One key benefit of track 2 and 3 dialogues is the opportunity they provide for participants to build relationships with one another. Have you analyzed or noticed how a dialogue over Zoom or other technological means differs from traditional mediation efforts? And can you suggest how online dialogues may be designed to enable deliberation across the divide that would not be possible in offline settings? So Andreas, would you like to take that over?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a question that has been bothering, I think, practitioners for a while, particularly during the pandemic. And it's not easy to really study this in a kind of a controlled manner, because you're running a dialogue effort either online or offline, but you're not running it twice in the same way. But I think so. I mean, just from what I've heard from others, I think a couple of years ago there was certainly the sense that it's difficult to build trust online, and therefore it would be difficult to actually have anything like a profound substantial deliberation or in online conferences, for instance. Now, some think that if you have a in-person meeting at first, and you may know that from when you talk to friends online, then you have an easier time to actually have a profound discussion also after that through the remote technologies. So it's not as straightforward. I think what's important, we've done a bit of a study in the Ukraine context before last year's invasion, where it has proven difficult for facilitators, for instance, on track 2, to build this kind of a grounded environment in which people then feel comfortable to actually relate to one another and to do kind of all the additional little activities that you would organize at the margins of a a workshop. For instance, if you have a multi-day workshop and you're meeting in a certain place, in a venue, you would, you can organize a walk, or you can organize a joint dinner, etc. But the facilitators are quite creative in some contexts to actually find replacements for this. So in that sense, again, I think the question of like, is it really the digital that makes the difference is falling a little bit short. I think it is quite important to think again about, the social practices that can basically build around in to find adequate replacements. I hope I did answer that question. I copy the link to the article in question into the chat then right now.
Could I pop in for a second on that too? Because it's been on my mind as well. It's a great question. And so for me, I'm an anthropologist that has lived and worked in Ukraine since 2015. And so I didn't write my policy brief on that. I wrote it before the 2022 escalation, but I've been thinking a lot about it in the way that it's shown possibilities and also challenges. I have found, for example, I go into trust building in my brief, and I think that's indispensable. And I think that there's a certain amount, especially around sensitive topics, that are really hard to replicate solely online. So what I found is that people that I've worked with, on the ground, as a presence on the ground, there's still a lot of trust. But even there are challenges with that feeling of technology safety, that, Ukraine has a very sophisticated IT setting. And because of that, throughout the sort of 9 years of this war, it was always sort of known that a lot of things can be hacked, that communications can be hacked. And so what I've seen happen are the reliance on kind of like shorthand, like, hey, remember that thing that happened here, like, sort of getting messages across, but then also even people that I've worked with for many years where trust is not an issue will say something like, ooh, we need to save that for an in-person conversation, particularly around these sensitive topics. And so I think, for all of the theoretical work that I propose in my brief, that there are also these structural and technological needs, like for secure comms, and not just for them to actually be secure, but for people to also know and be confident that they're secure, because the stakes of those not being secure are really high. And then it's also, for me, I think, just emphasized again, the reality that you need to rely on networks that are built in person before circumstances might force you to go offline, that perhaps the networks can expand online, but these central nodes of people who know each other and who have that credible history, both local and international and everywhere in between, is still really important, and perhaps especially important in times of crisis.
It's really interesting. Julia's had her hand up for a while, so I'll give the floor to you, Julia, and then Faraz has a question. I actually have a question as well, but why don't you go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and hi, Kristina and Andreas. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you both as great colleagues. I've always been a fan of both of your work. So it's cool to see you two together, because I think there's a lot there. My question was for both of you on this idea of the decentralization of peace processes through this turn to digitalization, and this term like WhatsApp diplomacy that you hear in kind of like the Geneva circles, and things now, being done, not even just on Zoom, but like WhatsApp. And whether that is sort of emancipatory past these elite negotiations, doing away with this notion of a table, or whether it becomes more exclusive, or whether, like, what are your takes on this? Because I don't actually know where to place it. And I think with this, so I think that's my question there. What does it replace? And then what happens when entire dialogues are run over in small WhatsApp groups or individual messages to each other? Thanks.
Why don't we hear your initial thoughts on that question as well, and then I'll just go ahead with Faraz's questions afterwards.
Andreas, would you like to start?
I actually want to hear what you think first.
Okay, yeah, this is a great question. I mean, these are the key questions, so thank you for getting right to the heart of it. So I was thinking about, places of my expertise, and then also places perhaps of yours, Julia, with Myanmar. I am very conscious of the fact that I wrote my policy brief on it, but you're the real expert there. So it'd be interesting to compare notes. I think that, that that there are always going to, I mean, this is an anthropology speech, right? But we have this sort of general idea that perhaps it's not human social organization that undergoes radical change, but it's the technological venues for how we operationalize those instincts. And so I am very sensitive to the fact that, technology is a tool, that it'll create new possibilities, but it may also reinforce these hierarchies. I think exactly what you're talking about. So, if we've often used this metaphor of bringing local voices into the corridors of power, I'm very sensitive to, I think, the important critique that you're raising. If perhaps it'll just be a metaphor change, we need to bring local voices into the WhatsApp groups of power, versus actually decentralizing it. So again, I think, technology is a tool, but it's proceeding very cautiously, very carefully, raising these ethical questions, because I think that, again, it's more about these instincts of human social organization or exclusion or solidarity. The opposite is possible, and how we bring these into new technological tools without relying on the technological tools themselves to save us, or to solve the problem, but it's understanding how they can, and then making sure that we're sensitive, that they're not just further reinforcing hierarchies in a different way, in a different venue.
Yeah, I mean, Julia, I think you probably did not expect a straightforward answer, so you won't get one. But so I think it's a very important question to reflect on. I think, at least in the academic literature, there was probably a bit of a tendency a couple of years ago, I think also in the policy and practice literature, to kind of romanticize digitization, digital approaches. And particularly those folks who are fans of local peace building or bottom-up peace building, then we're starting to see how can this be used for local peace building or bottom up, and terms like crowdsourcing became quite prominent. And certainly, I mean, if you want to use technology in this particular way, then you can use it in this particular way. You can, of course, also use it in the other way, i.e., like have a kind of an exclusive process. When you talk about the corridors of power and bringing local voices or bottom-up voices into the corridors of power, I mean, one thing that strikes me is it's quite easy to shut those virtual corridors. If you have a human in a corridor at the UN somewhere, it takes a bit more time to carry that person out of the corridor or out of the building, virtually, physically speaking. So I think there is a risk when it comes to digital approaches, such as WhatsApp consultations, etc., that it's easier for third parties and also international actors who support these processes, and for conflict parties to not be accountable to the voices that they've just brought into the room, virtually speaking. So you can run your consultation and then you can write your report, but there's no need to go back to the local level necessarily. And I think if you are running consultations in a physical sense, you have to travel to these spaces again and again and again. And I think therefore accountability might be higher. I think what's important to realize, certainly with digitization, is that it does change some of the microdynamics, and I think it is creating more opportunities for relational exchanges of information. Certainly, certain kind of conventional power holders in a process, such as mediators, such as conflict parties, might see their authority to some degree challenged. You have social media influences, you might have other bottom-up movements that can form, that can easily create nodal points on social media, attract followers, attract attention, and possibly influence processes, particularly if they turn into mass movements. And that is something that we haven't seen in the same way before. So, and that's something that we are trying to, in my current research, trying to capture with this idea of APO mediation. But it's not a straightforward process. Yeah.
After being quite pessimistic, I can add one note of optimism. At the end of the day, influencing policymakers is often influencing writing, because policy documents are documents, or they're talking points, or there's something like that. And, with the way that policy often works internally, it is not uncommon. For example, if a policymaker calls an expert, or an expert emails them something that and the policymaker likes it, if it's an internal document, that can usually almost just be copy and pasted, like almost verbatim into a document, just with the nature of that those work. And so as I'm sitting here thinking about it, perhaps one of the opportunities of WhatsApp groups are, a policymaker no longer has to find just what they like in their inbox or in the newspaper, but perhaps they might actually have the real, thoughtful, written, expressed thoughts of local actors in such a way that it might be easier for them to actually be brought into those documents, which do result in often real change, whether it's messaging or allocation of funds. So just a note of optimism there.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to read out Faraz's question. So he put in the chat for both. What do you think about the phenomenon that in the context of violent conflict, open source information, and it is another war front, and the information we can collect and analyze is subject to high levels of contamination? Is this a high enough risk to hinder the efficacy of utilizing mass information to inform policy, especially with resources available to verify and check the validity of information in the field of peace building? I also have a question as well to both. It's not unrelated actually to Faraz's. It's about, you both talk about kind of stakeholders, and I was wondering the relationship that people that are scholar practitioners essentially are having or should have with social media companies, because I feel like we're seeing a rise in online content that perhaps doesn't violate the actual terms of service of these private companies, but does fan the flames of conflict and can very much result or even directly cause violent flare-ups. But I feel like there's also, of course, a kind of conflicting interests in that a lot of companies, they don't have mandate or really interest in sharing their data that they have, perhaps, or really being receptive to perhaps policy changes for whatever interests that are at play. And it almost seems like there needs to be like a dialogue between peace actors and facilitators and social media companies. Like it almost seems like that needs to be a mediated conversation sometimes. And I was just wondering if you have any, you spoke a little bit about that, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that. And that's, again, to both as well. So whoever would like to go first, you're welcome to.
Sure, so I can hop in there. So after writing this policy brief, I did about an 8-month project with my research collaborator, Ernesto Verde at the University of Notre Dame. And we were able to do this project where we interviewed a lot of people from tech companies. So we interviewed over 100 actors from tech companies, journalists, local peace builders, NGOs, sort of tried to cover like 6 major groups that we feel interact with this topic. And I very much had my policy brief in mind. And, quickly, one of the takeaways there for me was that tech company is also not a monolith, as much as local voices are also not a monolith. And so what I kind of found was something that I shouldn't have been surprised at, because, so for example, at least for me, speaking for myself, I'm a little bit more familiar with the policy scene. And I know that the way to figure out, to change policy is to find a person who is both receptive maybe to hearing what I have to say as a scholar and who knows how to work the system, right? It's not enough just to convince one person. They've also got to be kind of influential in their own policy ecosystem. And that was actually very much what I found in tech company circles as well. So there are true believers who participate in their offices of oversight and various things like that. It's very uneven. So some companies devote a lot more resources to it than others. But I would say even in the ones that were more resourced, I could kind of sense these are, off the record, non-attributable conversations. So we felt like we were able to hear some candor. you could feel that even for those who join tech companies wanting to change these issues, that there are still some internal battles to fight. And so I think being sensitive to that, figuring out points of pressure for tech companies as a whole is really important, while also keeping in mind that there might be reform-minded voices there. And so kind of figuring out smart advocacy to do so in such a way that creates political capital for those type of voices, and doesn't just maybe throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the expression says, and kind of marginalizes them.
Yeah, great, Kristina. I think you answered the second question, so I'll skip that one and just talk about the first one, which I find really, really important. Yes, there is a drive towards open source information and evidence gathering. And in fact, yes, crowdsourcing approaches enable that, but we do have to deal with the increasing amounts of mis and disinformation that are floating around. And in the article that I've copied before into the chat that we're talking about this, we're talking about how difficult it actually is to create a sense of epistemic certainty today. There are efforts to do that, but then again, it's not only about the tech or the data that you have, it's about the method that you can apply. So obviously you have specialized NGOs now, or initiatives that develop methodologies that they also share online or for courses, for kind of forensic open source research on, for instance, human rights violations and these kind of things. But I think it's also important to ask why we would want to have epistemic certainty. I think there is, of course, when it comes to specific contentious issues, it is quite important to know what has happened. When it comes to human rights violations or these kind of things, it is important, certainly after conflict, to have clarity about this, so that these things don't get remain unpunished. But when it comes to the particular dialogue process, in fact, I would actually question to some degree whether we do always need to have epistemic certainty, or whether other forms of certainty are similarly important, such as a sense of where this is all going, something that you could call a normative certainty or ontological certainty, a sense of where peace process should go, why negotiations should continue, and what issues need to be resolved. And I think here there is a role for digital approaches to help with that as well, and we're discussing some of them in the paper. I think when it comes to dialogue context, one thing that has been really understudied and underemphasized is the kind of a tech affordance that's not about creating what I would call sincerity, as in like getting a real sense of what the world is like, as if this has happened and that has happened, but creating kind of a subjunctive sense of what should happen in the future, where the process should be heading, etc. And here it's quite interesting to look, for instance, at the role of visualization methods and data aggregation methods that help in a dialogue context to actually help participants move the conversation forward. I think Kristina in her presentation mentioned data points and how they don't do the trick, how you need to go back to having kind of a grounded perspective. That's certainly the case. But I also think that, in fact, like sometimes you just don't need to obsess with data or with epistemic certainty altogether. You can really just find ways of like moving on while not exactly being able to fully establish a kind of an empirical picture. So I'm posting another link. So sorry for spamming you guys, but I'm posting another link to another article because I cannot fully explain the argument right here, right now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. No, definitely paste links away. So we're in our last 15 minutes. If anybody else has a question, I would really encourage you to put your hand up or put it in the chat now. I have one very brief question, if I may. It's actually just what you folks would advise or your input on kind of the future of peace building education and how media literacy, but even like more quantitative skills, perhaps data analysis skills, should they be incorporated into that, or is that something, or open source intelligence training, things like that? Are those things that you see as valuable for future, I guess, programming for peace building education?
Yeah, great question. So I feel very lucky in my day job because I'm a professor that just works with our PhD students in conflict management, which means that I spend all of my teacher brain time figuring out what conversations we need to have in the classroom before they go out. And the thing that I always just emphasize for them is that I think more and more it's becoming, I think, a norm, but also something that's very important to work in teams. So, I do my anthropological work, I write up my articles, but I'm also involved, for example, in projects where I work with a fellow peace building scholar and a team of computer scientists to look at, for example, visual disinformation, so basically memes. And I can't do that. I can bring some of the thematic knowledge that's in my policy brief. I can talk about, forecasting, I can talk about the things we know about peace building, but I can't create algorithms that scrape through millions of data points, which is what they can do. But when we talk, they often don't know maybe some of the more peace building questions to ask. And so when I'm having these conversations with my students, I really encourage them to find their methodological grounding, the way of understanding the world that seems to suit their talents. So maybe it'll be more quantitative, maybe it'll be more qualitative, but also to really spend that time networking as a field with people who are different than us, but who might be interested in similar topics, and figuring out those research clusters that they'll sit in. So just a couple of thoughts there on that.
Yeah, I think I can just second what Kristina said. I think there needs to be more diversification of knowledge. It's quite difficult for one single person to be able to cover all aspects when it comes to the socio-technical. I think you need to have people who are leaning more on the social side and the technical side. And I think maybe when it comes to education, I think maybe kind of on a meta level, I think it's quite important to think about how, in fact, these interdisciplinary processes, both for research but also for practice, can unfold and how they can be managed. I know that tech companies employ people who just do moderation, and they just basically do moderation between coders and non-coders in their companies. And maybe we need these kind of people in the future as well. I hope that organizations in the field can afford them. Yeah, leaving it here.
Really interesting. Peter has a question. This is actually a question that I thought Faraz was going to ask. It says, the question of measuring and evaluating the impact of dialogues is a key problem for, quote, traditional dialogue work. Any thoughts on how this issue will be addressed for work in the digital space? That's a really good question.
Sure. So I must have, not had enough coffee this morning because a pessimistic thought immediately occurred to me. But let's see. So Peter, it's such a good question. I mean, I'm really enjoying this hour we have together because these are questions that get to the heart of the issue. And the thing that I immediately thought of with monitoring and evaluation is this tendency to accidentally measure input instead of impact. And I can see the pessimistic thought that I alluded to was that, we could be awfully tempted to just track maybe number of messages exchanged or period of time that a WhatsApp group was really active, maybe during a crisis point in the surrounding time. But is that, again, really measuring impact, or is it just, again, falling into that trap of measuring input? So I think when we measure impact, I think the only way to do it is to really surge a kind of research design before a crisis, because to measure that impact, you've got to set up some kind of goalposts before you. You could try to do some after action reviews, but again, really saying that, crisis A is unfolding and there is a WhatsApp group. So what impact might come from it? And setting that question up right in the forefront, because I think, again, this after action review could fall into counterfactuals. It could fall into these tendencies, again, to measure input in various data points and not impact. So perhaps as much as we can, just being clear, like in our scholar practitioner roles, about what we think the goal of an interaction is, is it for solidarity? There are ways that you can measure and you can sort of set maybe some impact. Are you measuring, you're hoping to get word to policy community X that you want the message or the analysis of the conflict to change in this way? I think being really, really clear as early on as we can what that moment in time goal is set, and then sort of tracing back over it. But again, those are really challenging comments, because I'm very well aware of the fact that these type of research designs are going to be happening in an acute crisis moment if following the research plan I'm suggesting.
Yeah, I think I would also be probably rather skeptical whether there will be a revolution through digitization when it comes to M&E. Partly because I think there's just so much going on in peace processes, and they are really, really complex. And I don't think that all of these aspects will be datafied anytime soon. There is a lot that's happening informally in the corridors, inside people, between people that can't be just datafied. And obviously, therefore, the attribution gap will remain real. I think there are just so many other kind of, if you want to call it this way, intervening variables that can't be measured out. And then we also know that there isn't really any linearity in peacemaking. So there is not that one theory of change that will always work, right? So even if you can attribute a certain outcome to a certain output, for instance, it doesn't mean that it will actually work in another case, or that's really proving that you've done it right. So I'll be skeptical about that. To make things worse, I think we should expect, and I think we can already see this, that obviously digitization creates, as we've already discussed quite broadly, more data points, and there is a risk, I would say, that there will be a stronger drive towards activities and projects that can be measured. And when it comes, for instance, to responding to hate speech or disinformation online, you can have organizations counting how much content they've reported to Facebook and how much has been deleted, or how many counter messages have been written, etc. And then maybe you can quantify then also how in your impact cycles, how narratives have changed, etc. But again, I think then there is a risk that all the stuff that's a bit more complex, and that's complex because it can't be measured, and it's also complex because it can't necessarily be fixed through digital intervention, gets left aside. So thinking about them, and working on the socioeconomical drivers of online hate speech, etc. That stuff can be measured easily, and it also can't be responded to so easily. So I'd be cautious basically about the effects of digitization on M&E and all, but also on programming. So really important to keep on reflecting about that.
I think too, this is getting an issue that I tried to bring into my policy brief, which is there's such a temptation, and I understand it, right? So you're a policymaker, let's say you even have very strong normative commitments. That's why you joined the UN or you did whatever. There's such, I think, a human psychological temptation to hope that a new advancement of some type could be like the missing link that might help you do your job better. And I think that now probably many of us have been around long enough to see how these kind of maybe thematic clusters kind of have their moment in the sun. And I think the same thing can happen too with technological tools. So one of the recommendations that I make in the brief for policymakers specifically is to recognize that, like, yes, technologies can provide some new potential possibilities, but they can also provide new challenges. And I think some of those challenges are lapsing a little bit into the silver bullet mentality. In my policy memo, I talk, for example, about something like IQs or Centurion, or finding, I quote a CNN article from 10 years ago, which was like finding peace in the data, and just to remember too that these are tools, but there are, for example, with AI, I think we've now moved on from maybe big data back then to like AI now. There's humans behind these processes. There's humans making analytic choices in big data. There's humans driving algorithms when they create AI. And so just kind of not losing sight of that. And from the policy perspective, remembering that you may have a new tool, but the need for human expertise, particularly local expertise, never goes away.
Thank you so much to both of you. There's some kind comments in the chat, and I can just echo them. Both the briefs and also this discussion, both the presentations and the Q&A were really enriching and really informative. And I'm really excited to see where both of your work goes. I'd love to hear about it as it develops. We are only 3 minutes until the end of this talk. So perhaps if you have any questions, it would be best to email Andreas or Kristina. Both of their emails are in the policy briefs, which we've linked in the chat. I just wanted to thank everyone else, everyone here once again for coming, for asking comments, or asking questions, making comments, as well as just showing up. And again, this is part of our wider colloquium series. That link was put in the chat. I would really encourage you guys to sign up. If you're part of our mailing list, you will also get the email notifications. Okay, I just wanted to echo thank you once again. I don't think we have any more contributions from the audience. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have, oh, there's one. Yeah, Peter says thank you. Yep, I hope everybody has a great Tuesday.